Greetings and salutations, my friends. Welcome to another glorious day here at Tango Talks. And today, we're talking about Pantheon Rise of the Fallen and the Enchanter, and specifically Charm and a few other abilities that the Enchanter may possess in Pantheon Rise of the Fallen. So, strap in, my dudes, it's going to be a good one, and let's dive right in.
They say that we are to fight for the little people. But who, I ask you, is more little than we?
All right, bros, before we get into the nitty gritty, we're going to talk about my experience with MMOs and the Enchanter class specifically. I mained a Chanter in EverQuest for years. I had many alts, but Chanter was always the main man. My favorite thing about the Enchanter was the ability to control the battlefield using CC, which is short for crowd control, with combinations of stun combos and charm, as well as pulling combined with other tools like lull and bind sight, which allowed you to see through the eyes of another creature. It felt extremely powerful, especially in EQ, where you had the ability to manage the battlefield and manage fights in a way that most other players could not. It was thrilling to live on the edge of doom because of the way Mesmerize and Charm worked. Either the mob was mezzed or it was not. And while it was mezzed, it could at any moment break out of that mez, or the mez could last its entire length. You didn't know, and you could have 4, 5, 6 mobs mezzed at any given time, and each one had their own timer that you had to be aware of. There was an AoE mez, but it wasn't very effective over the long term, and it was very, very mana inefficient. And it was so well done in EQ, in my opinion, that people loved enchanters for it, especially those that mastered the art of crowd control and would seek you out for it specifically. There were many places in EQ that were extremely hard to farm if you didn't have sufficient CC or a good puller and slow. Mobs did so much damage that more than 2 of them was not efficient for heals, or some healers couldn't even keep up with the damage. And a bad pull could wipe your entire group. But with an Enchanter who is fairly good at their job, a bad pull simply turns into a long, drawn-out fight, casually picking off mobs one at a time while the Enchanter teeters on the edge of death. I also used to love to solo Charm, mostly late game because early game it's kind of wonky with weird level requirement stuff going on. It was fun for CC in groups as well. Because of the rando timer, it was a pain if you wanted to get rid of your charmed mob, although you could use Invis. I did that a lot, where you charm a mob as a form of CC after mezzing all the other mobs, and then once the fight is over, you Invis and they kill it. Easy peasy, lemon squeezy. It became somewhat overpowered way later in the game and in later expansions due to mob scaling, because mobs became so much more powerful with like quad hitting and crits and so on and so forth, especially the wizard mobs and the caster mobs. Permacharm was nice because it was better than the default pets. It would never break, so there were no worries and no hassle of normal charm. But it was limited as and not nearly as good as normal charm. WoW and other MMOs seem to have forsaken CC as a class imperative, or just in general as a useful and or mandatory game mechanic as a whole. Most fights in modern MMOs like WoW are tank and spank-ish, and it's about DPSing down fights while the tank tanks all the damage than it is about CC. And this is laid out in the design of the game, the dungeons, and the classes themselves. CC and WoW specifically is spread out amongst most classes. Rogues get sap, mages get polymorph. Paladin's stun is a fairly good short-term CC. Druids get root, which is a fairly good CC as well. But ranged and caster mobs will still be able to do damage to your group. They just won't be able to get in your face. And warlocks who get a succubus pet that can charm, quote-unquote, a mob, which is essentially a channeled stun by the pet. And these are used in most fights to take 1 or 2 mobs out of the fight for at least a little while everybody else DPSs down the rest of the group. Now, this is by no means a fully extensive list. It is just what comes to mind when thinking about modern MMOs and the CC that they have within their games. So you have most of the CC in the game spread around to various different classes, or the CC itself is extremely limited in scope and duration, short stuns and mezzes, or it's both of them, where it's spread amongst all the classes and is extremely limited in scope and very short in duration. It does appear to me that the reason this has taken place is because it's more action-oriented to be fighting a giant group of mobs while crowd controlling one or two, rather than, in the Enchanter's case in EverQuest, being able to pull 5 or 6 mobs, mezzing all of them but one, maybe two, and just fighting those one at a time. It definitely leads to a flashier style of gameplay rather than a more strategic style of gameplay, at least in this Enchanter's opinion. When WoW first came out, I was actually kind of mad when I realized there was no CC class. I was specifically looking for the class that would do something similar to the Enchanter in EverQuest. And when I realized that there was nothing like that, and like the closest thing you could get was either the Mage with Polymorph or the Warlock with the Succubus that could channel a CC spell, I was rather put off. I still played WoW for a long, long time, but it did take away some of the magic. It felt like it took away some of the strategic gameplay that was in the original EQ and really didn't substitute it with much of anything other than burn the mobs down with DPS.
To confuse your enemy, to instill them with fear using illusion and mimicry is but a cheap parlor trick.
All right, boys, so as far as going forward into Pantheon Rise of the Fallen, my opinions on Mmos and Charm are forthcoming. Mmos is a mandatory and is absolutely awesome. It's also very binary, which I would like to discuss at a later time, but I wanted to touch on it right now, just to let you know I didn't forget. Charm is something of a whole nother beast and is very interesting. So, in most games, Charm is a spell that you cast on a mob or enemy that allows you to dominate that mob and, through this domination, control it as if it were normal pet. In EQ, any mob that you charmed retained all of its stats and damage. It also retained its class abilities and its spells that it had, as well as the ability to cast them. So if you charmed an extremely powerful caster, wizard mob, let's say, then what it would do is it would nuke the living crap out of your enemies that you told it to kill. Because of all of this, Charm could destroy balance in a game or be really fun and engaging. But in the end, it's still binary, just like Mmos. The mob is either charmed or it's not. As stated earlier, in EQ, due to mobs becoming insanely powerful in the late game, Charm also became insanely powerful. And in a game like Pantheon Rise of the Fallen, with modern internet, anything like the old school EQ Enchanter would spread like wildfire and be problematic for both game players and developers. To paraphrase someone from the forums named Neshtfell, I believe that's how you pronounce that, just because Charm is horribly unbalanced in EQ does not mean it has to be horribly unbalanced in Pantheon. Now, many will argue that it's not horribly unbalanced in EQ, la 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 la. This could go on forever, but I do agree with Neshfeld that it is somewhat broken, especially now that everyone has access to the information. The current state of Charm in Pantheon Rise of the Fallen is that charmed mobs will have their stats lowered to bring them in line more with other pets. And that, for the most part, is okay. Nerfing mobs to have lower stats is a decent balance choice, but it's not very innovative. And it seems to maintain the risk of Charm without that juicy reward. With tweaking, it will definitely fix the extreme imbalance Charm can have in a game where mobs do significantly more damage than pets do or players do. So before I get into suggestions and changes, I would just like to say thank you to everyone who participates in the forums. I really appreciate you guys putting the effort in to make suggestions on changes or stuff that happened in the game, or just talking about the game in general. It really helps, and it also gives me the ability to look at some of the stuff that I'm thinking and see how well it bounces off the rest of the community. And with all that being said, I would also like to iterate that most of the rest of this video is going to be about speculation on the forums and within my own head, and none of it, so far as I know, is going to be in Pantheon Rise of the Fallen. It does feel like the suggestions coming out of the forums for the changes to Charm feel like different takes on the same theme: nerf the stats. And I'm not really sure how I feel about Permacharm in general being random chance. I do mostly agree with Janus about Permacharm. He is an individual on the forums. Highly appreciate your contributions, dude. Loved your posts on Charm. One of the biggest is that even a small chance means it could become very, very broken because players will efficient the fun out of everything. If there is a chance, even a small one, to charm a mob and have it be permanent and never break, then players will find ways to ensure that they get a mob permanently charmed, either by sitting there and continuously charming them over and over and over and over again to break it until they figure it out. Yes, it may be a time waster, but some players will find it worth it. And once one person figures it out, it won't be long until almost the entire community knows how to break it in half. I am definitely of the agreement that permacharm should reduce all damage, abilities, and stats to be in line with other pets, if not lower. With no real risk comes no juicy reward, and so it should just be a pet that has some cool abilities that are in line with the mob that was charmed. So what to do about all this? Well, action should be taken to make it so a single enchanter cannot control a powerful pet and be elite CC at the same exact time, especially in a group setting. So how do we do this? One suggestion is, instead of reducing mob stats flatly for all charmed mobs, you instead reduce charmed mob stats based on how many people are in a group. So reduce charmed mob stats based on how big the group is. So if you're only grouping with one other dude or maybe two, then the mob stats are essentially the same. But the bigger the group gets, the more the mob stats are nerfed. And you can even use in-game reasoning for this, as the mob hates all of you and your entire group, and you're flaunting it in front of them, making it harder for you to control that individual. You could even apply this to groups where you have multiple enchanters charming mob, where you nerf the stats and scale it based on how many charmed mobs there are in the group, and or increase mob break chance RNG for the same reasoning as before. This should discourage supergroups of enchanters, where you have a bunch of enchanters get together with a single healer or such, and they all get charmed mobs, and they chain mez, chain stun, and use their essentially overpowered pets to do things that groups normally could not do. You could also reduce CC ability while having charm mobs, or just increasing the charm break chance RNG when you are performing heavy mezzing. Reasoning that it's harder to concentrate on mezzing individuals in a fight when you also have a charmed pet, making it near impossible to maintain a high DPS charmed pet and be an epic crowd control master in a group. You could also have charmed mobs eat experience based on the damage they do, and or eat more experience in group settings the bigger your group gets, scaling with the size of the group, just like the other suggestions. In case you were unfamiliar, mobs, or pets in this instance, eating experience means that if a mob were to give 100 experience and your pet eats 50 of that experience, that means every time you get a kill, you're getting half the experience of normal. And so I officially toss my hat into the ring, and we're going to talk about a system that I've come up with that I think solves both the binary problem and the enchanters being overpowered because they have a super pet and can be elite crowd control at the same exact time. Oh, and let's not forget buff bots as well.
Bending a creature's will, dominating their mind, turning them against those they once called friend. This is true power.
All right, my dudes. Well, I'm going to let you know that this suggestion is a little bit complicated, so I'm going to have some graphics up to illustrate what I'm talking about, as well as just talking about it. My charm system is a representation of the battle of minds between you and the mob. So aside from just having a charm spell, you also add a support spell that works on the charmed mob after charm is cast. This is used to maintain control of the mob and links the mind of the enchanter to the mob. This could be the justification and flavor text for it. It would require recast, which would drain mana consistently. You could also add a skill to be associated with the support spell. Say we call it Mind Link. Like any skill, as you level up, it becomes more powerful with use, and specifically with mastery points, either in the support spell or in charm itself. Along with this, you would add a UI element to show the degree of control you have over a mob. A 0 to 100% scale would be sufficient. Maintaining above a certain threshold should prevent the mob from breaking out of charm. RNG can be introduced into how much decay the scale has per tick. So for every tick of the server, there is a certain amount that will decay, and that is a range, not a set number. And that range is based on RNG, which could take many different things into account, like the level of the mob, the disposition of the mob, the magic resistance of the mob, the charisma and the intelligence of both the mob and the caster, the type of mob that it is, i.e. from racial difference, if it is from an intelligent race. Dwarves, elves, and humans should be harder to charm than goblins and kobolds. And this would go for the rest of the intelligent races in Terminus, whether you can play them or not. Is the mob a humanoid? Non-humanoid should be harder to charm due to the differences in how the mind works. Not just animals, but in many MMOs, you can fight plants. And should you be able to charm a plant? Maybe. Should it be harder to charm and maintain that charm than, say, charming something that is closer to what the caster is? The RNG could also take into effect the amount of combat and or who your charmed mob is fighting. Not allowing downtime in between fights increases drain, because you're putting more strain on the mob's mind to maintain dominance. If they are fighting friends or the same faction, it should also increase drain, as it should be harder for you to maintain domination over someone who is fighting members of their family, for instance. If they are fighting a hated enemy or a different faction or species, it should be less hard and should increase drain less. It is easier to convince a thrall to fight hated peoples and animals rather than friends and clansmen. Differing levels on this scale could determine how much stats are nerfed and or buffed. Starting out at low levels, even with the bar maxed at 100%, you should still have a slight debuff. This signifies that not only do you suck at it, but it's also really, really hard. Also, it could be easier to maintain a higher percentage at lower levels to ease you into the difficulty that's going to come later with all the RNG. As your mind link skill and or mastery increased, so does the scale adjust, where eventually you will only get a debuff at, say, less than 50%. And a buff to stats at or above 85 to 90%. And just to throw in more things to shake up the binary dichotomy, mobs at low thresholds could disobey orders to fight, and or at lower thresholds may not be able to use certain abilities like spells or combat abilities that they would be able to use at higher thresholds. Mobs at a threshold of 20 to 15% or lower will also have chance to break out of charm, and those chances should go up as the control threshold goes down. So with enough practice with the Mind Link skill and investment of mastery points either in charm or the support ability that you use to maintain Mind Link, Charmed Pet should be very powerful, which will be mitigated by a constant mana drain and player management by having to constantly recast the associated support spell to maintain the threshold of control on the bar. You could even have RNG play a role in how much each cast of the support spell increases your control over the mob. Taking all or some of the other factors that we have just discussed into account when determining how much to increase the bar per cast of the support ability. So I want to make something explicitly clear. This ability will work with Charm currently, so that you will walk up to a mob, charm that mob, and then as soon as you have them charmed, it will function like normal charm always has, but then you cast the support spell on them and it brings up the UI for Mind Link. From that point on, the mob will respond to you as a normal charmed mob, but you will have this UI element to help you determine how much control you have over them. As the bar slowly decreases with all the RNG that we've discussed, you will have to cast the support ability so that you can maintain the threshold above a certain point. If it falls below 20 or 15%, then you could lose the mob. If it falls below 50%, then the mob gains debuffs, scaling down. If you can keep it high, even at low levels, then you get no debuffs. And if you've mastered the ability and you have a really high mind link skill, or you have mastery points in it, then you could potentially get a buff to the mob's stats at or above 90 to 85%. I just wanted to spell it out all in one go there because it felt like my explanation was so long that you might miss something there. Even I was a bit confused. So hopefully I made it clear. Now, this system could also tie into controls for charm discussed earlier, i.e. making the bar drain faster and or a flat debuff the more group members you have in your party. You could also do the same for the more mobs that you have mezzed, ensuring that if you choose to become a charmer, the other enchanter abilities will suffer. And a way to explain this in-game is that it is due to mental drain such activities take upon your mind. Based on all these factors listed, this representation should show how successful a mob fights off your mental control. Rather than it being under the hood and surprising you and everyone else, it's a quantifiable thing that can be expressed to others. And while this system mitigates the risk of charm breaking, it requires attention and drains mana that could be used for other things like buffs, mezzes, and nukes, etc. And this should absolutely be different from Dire Charm. I thoroughly believe that Dire Charm should be its own spell, or if it still has a chance with normal charm, once the Mind Link skill is used, that charm is no longer permanent. And as stated earlier, permacharm mobs should be debuffed. No risk, no reward. That's explicitly what I think. Now, to touch on another ability that's in Pantheon Rise of the Fallen called Shock and Awe, I think this is a great step in the right direction. Basically, it's a spell that will allow you to confuse a mob so that it will attack its fellows. I think you should be able to use this while charming another mob and or while heavy mezzing. And I've seen many confuse this with actual charm. The flavor text itself states that it is a confusion rather than a domination, more like an illusion over the senses, I'm assuming based on that text. It should absolutely be very short duration, less than a fight or a pull, and RNG to break every tick based on various factors like discussed earlier, level, disposition, magic resistance, charisma, intelligence, type of mob, so on and so forth. It could be used as a form of CC that could trap two mobs, the one that you confused and the other aggroed to it. It could make them locked in combat and damage would break the spell like Mez. To prevent abuse, you could lower the damage of both mobs while fighting one another. The lore reason is that the non-confused mob is being very defensive to not take too much damage, nor is it doing very much damage because it knows the person is its friend. Because he's like, what in the is going on? And again, all of these are just suggestions and imaginings and musings that I've come up with, and none of this is how Pantheon Rise of the Fallen is going to work. Some of this is suggested from the forums, some of it is just speculation on my part. So take that with that giant fat grain of salt that it should.
What does one do with such power? Seek honor and glory, of course. For what else is there?
All right, so let's talk Mez. So Mez in most games is an ability that will stun an enemy for varying durations. Sometimes it's only 10 seconds to 20 seconds. Sometimes it can be upwards of a minute. It depends on the game and the level that you're at in most of those games. Also, any damage, for the most part, will break the Mez, returning control of the mob's body back over to itself. And Mez has been in limbo, so far as I can tell, for a really long time, since EQ, essentially. It's very binary, and even in most games, either they are Mezzed or they're not. It has RNG breaking every tick, or it's a flat stun time for X amount of seconds, none of which is overly compelling. To VR's credit, they are trying to innovate by adding a Enchanter dot that works while the mobs are Mezzed and disappears when the Mez is broken. Also, the spell is no longer listed on the website for Pantheon Rise of the Fallen. When they reorganized it a while back with all the abilities, it was removed. I do believe it's still in the game, but it is not listed on the website. It would also be really awesome to see transitions between the on and off state of Mez. This was suggested by Counterflesh, that Mez should fade out instead of abruptly ending. An example that I would like to see is once a mob is mezzed after a set duration, If it rolls to break the Mmos and just barely hits, it should wander in a small circle around where it was Mmos. This will give you warning that the mob is about to break its mesmerize. In a D100 scenario, say it needs a 50 and it rolls between a 50 and a 65, then it will wander around in a small circle around itself. If above that, it breaks. You could add even more modifiers, like if it rolled between a 66 and a 70, its mind is fuzzy/dazed and has some kind of stat debuff for a short time after breaking Mmos. Conversely, an easy innovation, quote unquote, would be to warn the enchanter that Mmos will break, maybe based on a skill the enchanter has or on a support spell that is either passive or is self-buffed. Some other suggestions from the forums are that some of the debuffs should maybe slow attack speed or run speed, but I don't like that as much as it feels redundant to other classes like shamans and the fact that enchanters usually get an attack slow as well. And last but not least, I'd like to talk about another really cool suggestion by Shadowbound for enchanters or other classes for that matter. And the skill suggestion is a nearsight ability that was apparently in the Dark Age of Camelot, where when you cast this spell of nearsight on a mob, it lowers their effective range, making it much easier to pull caster and range mobs to your group so that you don't have to rely on the tank or the puller to LOS or line of sight them to pull them toward the group. I really like this idea as it would increase the amount of cool things that an enchanter could do to help crowd control in a fight. While it's not a direct stun or mez or a charm, it would greatly increase their ability to manipulate the battlefield, which is one of the things that I absolutely loved about the enchanter. As a final note, I would just really like to say I like the direction that Visionary Realms is going. I would just wanted to throw out some suggestions and some ideas that I have just to get them out there in the ether and see what might stick. And I welcome any suggestions and discussion down in the comment section below. And I highly recommend you guys check out Pantheon Rise of the Fallen's webpage, as well as the forums where these things are being discussed. And I will throw links down in the description below. All right, my dudes, that's going to be it for the Tango Talks today. I want to thank you guys so very much for being here and sticking with me through all this. I hope you guys enjoyed this discussion as much as I did. It's definitely a bit longer than most of my normal videos, so I want to thank you guys for sticking through it. And I will state once again for the record that I am not associated with Visionary Realms or Pantheon Rise of the Fallen at all. No association. I'm just a super ultra mega nerd that is super duper hyped for what they are doing. And I do try to wear my bias on my sleeve so that you guys know when I state my opinion that it comes from that place. Don't forget, my dudes, to like and subscribe to let the algorithm gods know just what you like. And if you want to see me create content live, I stream almost every day on Twitch at twitch.tv/Tango Hotel. That's twitch.tv/Tango Hotel. All right, my dudes, it has been a pleasure and an honor to be with you here today at Tango Talks, and I will see you guys next time. Peace out.